presentation, and apologies for coming late. Very much a story of life in really existing capitalism in Poland. That first of all, I had to finish my lectures at 8 o'clock, and then as an unprotected worker, was unable to get a fast and comfortable train to Wrocław, so I had to wait till the next morning to burn up the resources of the earth and fly from Wrocław to from Warsaw to Wrocław, and even then the plane was delayed by 2 hours. So anyway, as Michał said, the title of this presentation is Poland, the Green Isle, or a country under crisis. And agreed to the answer is both. What I'm going to attempt to explain today is that in order for the left to come up with a credible alternative economic policy in Poland, that it has to take both of these realities into account in order to develop a viable alternative in Polish politics. So there basically at the moment exist two competing discourses regarding Poland's the Polish economy and its place within the present global economic crisis, if we can still call it a crisis, of course, because I think increasingly it's becoming not a crisis but a prolonged state. The first of these is to paint Poland as the green island in Europe. It's to point out that Poland has been the only... and therefore there is a temptation to counter this idea of Poland as an economic island of prosperity and growth with pointing out the inadequacies of the Polish economic system and the social realities of life in Poland today. So as I say, the problem is that both of these, I would say both of these discourses hold an element of truth, but they're partial discourses, and they do not fully explain the background and the reality of Poland's current economic position. So we come to this second option first of all, this option which is often taken up by the left. It's one which is used to counter the arguments of the current centre-right coalition government. And it's also one which is repeated in two places, widely repeated in the Polish media, particularly those parts of the media which are closest to the government, and it's also widely repeated in the international media. There's Adam Michnik, the famous opposition leader and editor of Gazeta Wyborcza. He points out and he says that when he goes abroad and he talks to people about Poland, and then he comes back and talks to people in Poland, he feels like he's talking about two different countries. I.e., what he's trying to say is when he goes abroad, everyone says, oh, fantastic, you're doing so well, you must be very happy, how is Poland succeeding? When he comes back, everybody moans. Now this is maybe just Adam Michnik being Adam Michnik, but there is some truth to this, is that in the international media there is a great propagating of the success of Poland at the moment, not just in the media, but politicians and so on and so forth. Okay, so countering this idea, which is often done for the left, and there were very many serious reasons why the left should oppose this view of Poland as being the green island in Europe. For example, unemployment since the outbreak of the crisis has increased from around sort of below 10% just in 2007, and is now going up to 13.5%, 14%. So, you know, in any kind of general European standards, this is extremely high unemployment. Poland has the highest percentage of workers, but particularly amongst youth who work in so-called junk contracts, that is insecure temporary contracts with little protection, low wages, no social benefits, and so forth. The public services are in a state of decline. as anybody who uses public transport, education, and the health service will know. And there's also the government is attempting to push through policies of deregulation and semi-privatisation of many of these services. There are deep social inequalities which have grown throughout the economic crisis. And also there are extremely large pockets of poverty which have not decreased throughout the whole period of the economic growth. Since even before the crisis, if we take the last 10 years in Poland, we can see that poverty has remained at the same level, despite the fact that the Polish economy has increased very rapidly, particularly before the crisis. After the outbreak of the crisis, economic growth slowed significantly, but continued. But over the last 10 years, for example, those people which have been estimated to be living in absolute poverty is around 2.2 million people, including 600,000 children. And this level has stayed the same throughout the past 10 years. In relative poverty, it's estimated to be around 17% of society, around 6.5 million people. And again, this figure has not reduced despite the fact that the economy has been growing. There's many reasons for this. And one of the reasons, for example, is that the government in 2006 froze the limit on which those are able, the minimum level at which people are able to receive social benefits. So between 2006 and 2010 this was frozen, which meant that around 2 million Poles lost the right to social benefits. And the number of families which are able to receive social help in Poland for their children decreased by a half. So, and you could go on. I mean, there are the historical legacies in Poland going back, far in history, and including the effects of the shock therapy transition, which pushed millions of people into poverty, has left its legacy in Poland, and the economic growth of the last 10 years or so, including that growth during the period of the economic crisis, has failed to significantly readdress these social economic problems. However, we should consider it's not true that we can therefore say economic growth is unimportant, that the economic growth of the past few years has had no effect, and that if the economic growth hadn't occurred, that people at the bottom of society as well as in the middle society's economic situation would not be worse, because this is the case, that economic growth and a policy of growth is an important element for a left economic programme, although we would obviously have different understandings of this, of sustainable growth. So let's just consider, first of all, the figures just simple GDP growth figures which have occurred in the region. Since the outbreak of the crisis, if we take the change in GDP and we take it from its peak just prior to the crisis, before economic growth began to slow or decline, we can see from the outbreak of the crisis, Poland's economy has grown by 10% during an economic crisis. It's grown by 10%. The next best performing economy in Central Eastern Europe is Slovakia, which has grown by around 1%. And then we go down. All the other, if we take the 10 Central East European countries, which are members of the European Union, all the other eight states, GDP remains at a level below that prior to the outbreak of the economic crisis. I mean, Czech Republic declined by 1 or 2%, we can go down to Bulgaria and Romania, which are like 4%, all the way down to the Baltic states, and the worst performing economy in the region being Latvia, whose GDP, and this is taking into account the economic recovery, the partial economic recovery which has taken place in the last year or two, the GDP in Latvia remains around 16% below the level it was just prior to the economic crisis. If the left is to say that the 10% growth in Poland compared to the 15% decline in Latvia is something which it does not concern it, and has had no effect on the social economic position of the Polish population, then this is just an absurdity. An absolute absurdity. So the left has to take into account what is it, not just not just the social economic problems which exist within the country, but what is it that has actually caused the economic growth to occur. And this is where, in some ways, the economic debate, the political debate has to take place. So where has the growth come from? And again, we can return to the first discourse. The discourse of the liberal right is that Poland is an example of successful liberalisation, deregulation, which has occurred over the past 20 years, and that the painful but necessary reforms which the country had to go through has borne fruit, and Poland has now stood as an example. So in order, for example, for the old European states to catch up again with the growth in Poland, etc., is that it should be replicating some of these. So reducing taxation, reducing rights of workers and so forth will enable capital to gain more resources and to instigate a period economic growth throughout the European Union. This is being kind of ideas put forward by the government and also by the most extreme wing of the liberal camp in Poland, represented by Leszek Balcerowicz and his so-called think tanks. The second example is when he says that they're trying to show this positive example of the free market economy in Poland and how the rest of the economies in Eastern Europe should replicate this. This is a wholly false account, and it's a false account for a number of reasons. And this is where the left should enter the debate, as well as pointing out the social economic problems. It should be pointing out what are the real reasons that the Polish economy has managed to grow during the period of economic crisis. And this isn't simple necessarily, but there is Poland in a way, maybe for the first time in its history, has been lucky to have been situated. We have a fortunate mix of events which has allowed it to continue economic growth over the past 5 years or so. There's a number of reasons. One, that its banking system was too old-fashioned and regulated and archaic and not advanced enough that it didn't suffer a huge economic collapse and didn't have to be bailed out by the government. So there wasn't a collapse in the banking system as there were in, for example, my own country, the UK. There was a relatively low level of personal debt in Poland. This is due to just up until Poland joined the European Union, interest rates remained in double figures. And therefore there was not the same expansion of personal credit and debt which had taken place in many of the, particularly in the Western European countries. The Polish economy is not similar, for example, to the Baltic, the small so-called financialized economies in the region, which were heavily reliant upon foreign direct investment and particularly the inflow of credit, private credit, and the expansion of a credit bubble in countries, particularly, as I say, in the Baltic states, which as soon as the economic crisis came and this capital flowed out of the region, because this was one of the fundamental causes of the crisis in Central Eastern Europe, was that the capital flowed out of the region once the crisis came and back to the core economies, in a sense came out away from the peripheries. This particularly hit those countries in the small economies in the Baltic states, which were heavily reliant upon this credit bubble. Poland, simply for its size in many ways, was not so reliant upon this credit, although it did of course have some effect. It's not an economy which is purely reliant upon export. So, for example, economies like Slovakia, Slovenia, to an extent the Czech Republic, were initially severely hit by the collapse of, for example, the car markets in Germany and so forth, and are heavily reliant or dependent upon one industry being the exports of cars. This, of course, also allowed these economies to go through some recovery once the German government introduced a car scrap scheme, and the intervention of the German government allowed some of these economies to grow again. And also it has to be said that Poland, not being tied to the euro, despite its best efforts, allowed it to devalue and allowed it some competitiveness. In a way, all those elements come in, and all those elements have an effect on the Polish economy. However, there is one major reason, I would say, for the Polish economy including these factors, which contributed to the economic growth of the past few years, and it's the reason which the Polish left, and therefore it should be propagating. The economic crisis in the world was primarily a crisis of investment. If you look at the components of GDP in, for example, the OECD economies, then the collapse in investment takes up over 95, in the period of the crisis, the initial 2 years or so of the crisis, takes up around 95% of the whole of the collapse in GDP. There's some small collapse in domestic demand, and some other elements of the economy actually grow. For example, government consumption and trade to some extent slightly grows. So the major effect of the crisis is investment. This is the fundamental collapse. And fundamental reason for the collapse is the collapse in private investment. Again, if you come to look at the economies in the Baltic states, then we find that the collapse in private investment is extremely high level. It's going to 20% and more. Huge collapse in private investment. In Poland, you have a small collapse in private investment. So between 2007 and 2010, private investment falls by less than 3%, by around 3% of GDP. It stood before, in 2007, around 17% and falls to around 13% of GDP in 2010. So around, it was slightly less than 4%. So there's a small fall in private investment, but this is counterposed by an increase in public investment. Public investment as a share of GDP throughout this same period grows from around 4% to 5.6%, leaving Poland having the highest level of public investment in the European Union, actually after Romania, which had a far greater fall in private investment. How is this possible? This has been primarily made possible by the availability of large funds through from the European Union in the form of structural and cohesion funds. So in the EU budget, which runs from 2007 to 2013, Poland is liable to receive around 68 billion euros in structural and cohesion funds. This is one of the main reasons of this, is that many of the poorest areas in Europe continue to lie in Poland, continue to lie particularly in certain areas of Poland. When we supplement this with government money, because there is, with EU funds, there is before the EU funds are granted, there is a negotiation about how much the national governments will supplement to these funds, then this adds up to 82 billion euros. What this has meant is that Poland has been able to embark on a programme of public investment in parts of the country's infrastructure at levels probably not seen since the 1970s and beyond. This means, for example, but I mean, anybody living in Poland can see parts of this. You can see just simply from the improvement of pavements, building of highways, the building of stadiums, and so on and so forth. So where does the left stand on this? The left, first of all, may criticise part of this, of course. You know, what the hell are we building 4 or 5 stadiums in Poland for? What's the point in that? Why are we prioritising building highways when you still can't get a train from Warsaw to Wrocław? What about more investment in green energies? What about actual investments in the health service and in education and in the productive sector and so forth? And this is absolutely right. That much of this money, I would say, is not going to leave a great legacy, although it leaves some legacy. However, the fundamental point remains is that the economic growth of the last few years has been driven primarily by this public investment. And this is a point which should be repeated, which should be put forward by the left, both domestically and also in Europe. And I'll return to that in a second. The other importance of underlining this point of public investment is that this public investment is coming under threat. As we progress into the second term of the PO government, then we can see that this course of government spending is coming potentially to a close. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is the ideological policies of the government. If you read the government statements and interviews with politicians and so forth, that they have a clear ideological aim. The main leaders of the present Citizens' Platform government in Poland come from a very strong neoliberal background. They were the previous so-called Gdańsk liberals of Tusk, Bielecki, and people like this, who were, at the time of communism, were printing the works of Hayek and so on and so forth. So they come from a very strong ideological, neoliberal, neoconservative background. But once they've come into government, they took a more pragmatic line. And why did they take this pragmatic line? What they say is that they want to emulate the policies of Thatcher, of Margaret Thatcher. And in order to do this, they quite rightly point out that Margaret Thatcher stayed in power for, well, she was in power personally for over a decade, and then of course it was followed by the Major government for another 4 or 5 years. So what they said is that in order to carry through large-scale restructuring, liberal restructuring of the Polish economy, you have to be in power for at least 2 terms. So they took the idea that the first term in office will be the term when they will go slowly. They won't repeat the example of previous liberal governments. And if you look at any liberal government in Poland up to the present one, they've come in, they've carried out some reforms, and people have kicked them out very quickly. So the good example was the government from '97 to 2001. The coalition of the Solidarity Electoral Alliance and Freedom Union government, and both of these political parties were not just defeated in 2001 after being in power for 4 years, but they disappeared from Parliament. They didn't win any parliamentary representation, and they disappeared as political parties from the political scene. It was quite incredible, the extent of the defeat of these parties. Now, people like Tusk and so forth were connected to this government. So the discussion within the Liberal camp was, no, we have to win a second term. We have to keep ourselves in power in order that we can carry out the radical necessary reforms which are needed. And we can see signs of this already. So yesterday we had the debate, the passing of the bill in Parliament to raise the pension age to 67, something which they would never have even considered doing in the first term of the government. And in fact, something they wouldn't even include in their manifesto at the last election. So we can expect that this government will take. I wouldn't actually expect it to take to go, for example, onto the side of Balcerowicz and go this extreme, but that it will take a more radical or more clearly stated sort of liberal economic policy. There's other reasons. There are external, internal pressures to reduce the budget deficits and public debt. And people may know that Poland has it's set in its constitution is that public debt cannot cross 60% of GDP, and if it does cross 55% of GDP, then the next budget has to be balanced, which of course would be severe spending cuts. And continually, the public debt is standing around just below this level of 55%. So there's pressure to have more spending cuts. And also Poland has bought into the current austerity program in Europe. One, it's signed up to the fiscal pact, although it's not bound by the agreements of the fiscal pact in Europe because it's not a member of the Eurozone. And it's also had a bilateral agreement with the European Commission that it will bring down its budget deficit to around 2% by the end of this year. That's supposedly what it's going to do. Its budget deficit presently is over 7%. We also have the end of Euro 2012. Thank God, I hear many people say, but this will, the end of Euro 2012, of course, will mean that there will be a stopping of many of the infrastructure projects which have been running for the last few years. Just one thing on Euro 2012. Euro 2012 brought no new public money into Poland. It was all the old EU funds that they're using. In my opinion, Euro 2012 has been a complete waste because it's meant that most of the public money has been put onto stadiums and so forth. I mean, it's good to have a nice stadium in Warsaw, but the amount of public money which has been spent on stadiums in the last few years is completely unsustainable in my opinion, and it would also waste a whole lot of funds which is only going to be available for a short timing period. And the second is a debate, so the last point is a debate within the European Union and the level to which how the present budget ends next year, and the next EU budget runs from 2014 to 2001. I think that's correct. And there is now presently a debate within the European Union. So what funds are going to be available? What funds are going to be available for the European Union? Of course, there's many sort of divisions appearing, but the simple divisions are that the richer states, which are in their own way going through policies of austerity, are attempting to reduce the amount of funds which they wish to pay into the next EU budget, which means that potentially there will be less money available from 2014. So we come back again. What should the left do in such a situation? I would propose that first of all, yes, it's correct that the left points out the injustices, the inequalities in Poland, the insufficiency of the government's social policies and its breaking up and privatisation of public services and so forth. This is absolutely essential to anything which the left is doing. However, it should also point out that the situation in Poland would have been much worse if the economy had gone through some form of economic decline, as had occurred in many other countries in Europe and in the region. And in particularly to underline how the supply policy, which has helped to drive the economic growth in the last few years, has been driven by a policy of public investment. And from this, the next point is to show the inadequacies of the public investment, the shortcomings of the public investment, but at the same time to begin to develop a program whereby you could have a more sustainable level of development through a more cohesive level of investment in areas of the economy, including in the productive economy. It's quite interesting. I don't know, some people will not be in touch with Polish politics. It's quite interesting to watch the new liberal populist movement in Poland around Palikot, when he stood up on May the 1st and said that, you know, the government should, if the private sector doesn't invest, maybe even the government should invest in factories. I mean, government should build factories. Fantastic, you know, first time I've ever heard a politician say this in Poland, but it's the kind of thing which is good to hear. At the same time, he's a politician which supports the fiscal pact. That means that you have to have a very tight and strict budget policy, keeping your budget deficit below 3% of GDP, and furthermore supports a flat income tax. Quite how you're going to build factories when you have these budget policies is unsure. It shows sort of levels of populism. So in contrast, the left should actually be taking a lead. And I would say is that it is very difficult for nation-states in the present economic reality in Europe, particularly those nation-states which continue to exist in some ways on the periphery of the European Union and the economies of the European Union, on its own to instigate a policy of public investment. It would have essentially been impossible, whilst remaining within the structures of the EU, for example, to Poland to have embarked on such a programme of public investment with its own money. And so therefore the aim of the Polish left should be to propagate the successes of the growth as an example of public investment in the region, to propagate the need for an expanded programme of green, environmental-led, sustainable public investment, and that this should be a programme which occurs within the EU, and this is where the debate of the left should begin to enter into the debate within the wider European left. And this is an example of a way in which the left could counter the austerity policies which are currently being pursued in the fiscal pact as an alternative, because the policy coming out of the European Union at the moment is one that growth can be led through austerity. The example of Poland is that growth, the opposite, growth is not led through austerity, growth is led when the government intervenes and the government invests in the economy.